mystery at the heart of Donald Trump's presidency.
Why is he so chummy with Vladimir Putin?
The Russians must have something.
He is creating a hero out of Vladimir Putin. What the hell is going on?
In fact, Putin is a strong leader, I can tell you that.
So smart.
Run by a very smart cookie, much smarter, much more cunning than our president.
He's attacked Republicans, he's insulted Democrats, he's even criticized world leaders and longtime allies. But there is one man Donald Trump will never target. We're talking, of course, about the inexplicable bond between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. This isn't just about politics. It's about personality, power, and an unspoken deal. In a notable shift of tone, President Donald Trump has expressed public frustration with Russian President Vladimir Putin regarding the ongoing war in Ukraine. This sentiment emerged during a recent White House meeting where the president revealed he is considering implementing new sanctions against Russia and authorizing increased indirect military support for Ukraine through arms sales to NATO allies. Despite this change in statement, a broader analysis of the administration's actions over the past 6 months reveals a continued U.S. policy trajectory that overall remains favorable to Russian interests and appears to undermine democratic principles, NATO cohesion, and support for Ukraine. The president's comments marked a departure from his typically complimentary language toward the Russian leader. He told reporters, "We get a lot of bulls thrown at us by Putin. He's very nice to us all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless." This statement suggests a personal grievance rooted in a sense of being misled rather than a fundamental objection to Russia's military aggression. Indeed, when Russia first invaded Ukraine over 3 years ago, President Trump characterized the act as savvy and genius. He has never described the invasion as an illegal or aggressive violation of international law, nor has he articulated a principled stance in defense of national sovereignty, a position that has long been a cornerstone of American foreign policy. This pattern is consistent with other comments threatening the territorial integrity of U.S. allies, such as suggesting the U.S. might take Greenland from Denmark or the Canal from Panama. Recently, the president's frustration does not appear to stem from the devastating humanitarian cost of the conflict. While he has occasionally made generic statements lamenting the loss of life, referring to the mess where so many people are dying, he has consistently avoided assigning blame to Russia for its documented attacks on civilian targets. This approach treats the war as an inevitable disaster rather than the result of specific actions by a nation-state. In a February meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, both President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance reportedly echoed Russian propaganda narratives, suggesting Ukraine was at fault for the war and dismissing President Zelensky's accounts of his people's suffering. This stance was further evidenced by the president's decision to previously block critical aid for Ukrainian air defense systems, a move that would have directly protected civilians from missile and drone attacks. When pressed on the reasoning behind pausing that aid, the president responded, "I don't know. Why don't you tell me?" Although military aid to Ukraine has since been resumed, analysts suggest the decision may be primarily driven by a desire to manage the administration's political image. The underlying complaint from the White House seems not to be that Russia is waging an illegitimate war, but that President Putin has not dealt fairly with President Trump personally. This distinction underscores a foreign policy approach that appears to prioritize personal diplomacy and transactional relationships over consistent support for a rules-based international order. A recent shift in rhetoric from the White House has highlighted a growing and very public sense of frustration from President Donald Trump aimed at Russian President Vladimir Putin over the ongoing war in Ukraine. This dissatisfaction appears to stem from the collapse of a central promise of the president's campaign, that his personal relationship with the Russian leader would allow him to swiftly end the conflict upon returning to office. The administration's strategy, which relied heavily on pressuring Ukraine and leveraging a supposed unique rapport with Putin, has failed to produce the desired ceasefire or the diplomatic victory the president envisioned. Now, this unfulfilled expectation is confronting the complex and stubborn realities of international geopolitics. The core of the frustration seems to be that President Putin has not followed the script that was anticipated. Rather than prioritizing a deal that would bolster President Trump's standing, the Russian leader has continued to act in what he perceives as Russia's strategic national interest. Observers note that Putin has not offered even a superficial concession that the president could present as a major win, such as publicly blaming the previous administration for the war. Instead, Putin's actions, including his refusal to engage meaningfully with the proposed negotiations, are seen by some analysts as a display of dominance, leaving the U.S. president without a diplomatic fig leaf to cover the failure of his approach. This dynamic may have finally prompted a tangible, if indirect, response, with reports indicating the president will authorize increased weapons sales to NATO countries, material that is destined for Ukrainian forces. This potential move, while a positive development for Ukraine's defensive capabilities, comes after a period of what critics have called farcical negotiations. The administration's leverage was significantly weakened from the outset by its own actions, including a relaxation of sanctions enforcement against Russia. This pattern of inconsistency has continued. At the end of May, the president suggested he might impose new sanctions, only to backtrack, citing a need to avoid hindering talks that showed no signs of progress. The power to enact sustained pressure now rests partially with Congress, where Republicans are considering a new sanctions package, but are unlikely to move forward without the president's explicit approval. Even if such a measure passes, its effectiveness remains in question, as enforcement could be lax and subject to the changing moods of an administration whose policy has consistently leaned in a Russia-favorable direction. A central tension has emerged in U.S. foreign policy, where the objective of cultivating a powerful political image appears to be diverging from the strategic goal of ending the war in Ukraine. The current administration's approach seems geared toward securing a short-term agreement that can be marketed as a victorious peace deal, a strategy reminiscent of past trade wars where the perception of winning was prioritized over substantive national interests. While President Trump has recently suggested he might impose new economic penalties on Russia, a nation notably exempt from his broader reciprocal tariff campaign, any such actions would first require extensive effort merely to re-establish the level of pressure that was previously in effect. Similarly, the announced plan to increase military sales to European allies may generate a diplomatic headline but is unlikely to alter Russia's fundamental strategic calculations, and even with full implementation, would take considerable time to affect the situation on the battlefield. The inconsistency in American support has had a direct and negative impact on the dynamics of the conflict. Pauses and overall reductions in military aid to Ukraine have inadvertently strengthened Russia's negotiating position, as any delay that allows for battlefield advances improves their leverage in any potential talks. This effect persists even when aid eventually resumes, because the interruptions degrade Ukraine's current combat effectiveness and signal to Moscow that its adversary may grow weaker over time. Countering this perception would require a significant and sustained increase in assistance, coupled with a credible return to an unambiguous American posture that firmly opposes Russian aggression. This gets to the fundamental, unalterable truth of the war, one that has remained constant despite numerous attempts to obscure it. Vladimir Putin initiated this war without provocation for reasons of national and personal ambition. He retains the ability to end it at any moment but actively chooses not to, not because he seeks peace, but because he is determined to dominate Ukraine and believes the extensive human cost is justified. For their part, the Ukrainian people have made a conscious and reasoned choice to resist subjugation by a foreign aggressor. They were not coerced or deceived into defending their nation. They voluntarily took up the fight to preserve their freedom and sovereignty. The core of the conflict remains this simple, brutal clash of wills, a reality that persists regardless of the political narratives constructed abroad. The path toward ending the war in Ukraine narrows to two starkly different outcomes. The first would see Russia achieve a military victory, leading to the dissolution of the Ukrainian government and the end of its sovereignty. The second, and only just and durable resolution, would require Russia to halt its campaign of conquest, either due to a collapse of its war effort or a strategic decision that the cost is too high. This could result in a unilateral withdrawal or meaningful concessions that Ukraine could accept in a negotiated settlement. Any other arrangement would likely amount to little more than a temporary pause, providing Russia an opportunity to regroup before launching future aggression. Altering Russia's strategic calculations, however, remains a formidable challenge. It demands sustained international effort and sacrifice. Such a course would inevitably disrupt factions within President Trump's political coalition that openly admire Vladimir Putin and view Russia as a champion in a global cultural struggle. It would also necessitate an acknowledgement that the prior administration and America's NATO allies were correct in their initial assessment of the conflict and the necessity of a firm response. Most significantly, this strategy cannot be primarily about crafting a public relations victory. It requires a genuine, consistent commitment to supporting Ukraine that transcends domestic political theater. A true shift in the U.S. position would be demonstrated only by a sustained and net increase in weapons deliveries and intelligence sharing with Ukraine, the application of real economic pressure on Russia, and a reaffirmation of solidarity with NATO and democratic allies in Europe. For a legitimate peace agreement to become possible, American pressure must be so credible and persistent that Vladimir Putin is forced to conclude he has more to gain by abandoning most of his war aims than by continuing his offensive. Counting on a combination of diplomatic incompetence and his to manipulate international dynamics. Given the long and complicated history between President Trump and the Russian leader, achieving this level of resolve remains an exceptionally difficult proposition. A significant and concerning shift in the American approach to the war in Ukraine is underway as President Donald Trump prepares to host Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House. This high-stakes meeting follows President Trump's recent discussions with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska, after which the U.S. leader abruptly abandoned his previous calls for a simple ceasefire. Instead, he now publicly advocates for a comprehensive peace agreement to end the conflict, a move that aligns him more closely with the long-standing position of the Kremlin. On his Truth Social platform, President Trump announced that it was determined by all that the best course was to pursue a full peace deal rather than a temporary halt in fighting. A statement that immediately raised questions about the nature of his private discussions with Putin. This sudden reversal places immense and immediate pressure on Ukraine. Analysts note that the U.S. position now appears to mirror Russia's core demand for a territorial settlement, effectively endorsing the premise that Ukraine must cede sovereign land to achieve peace. This development validates the deepest fears of many observers who worried that the Alaska meeting would result in President Trump adopting Putin's viewpoint and then attempting to force an unjust arrangement upon Ukraine. The situation may now be more precarious than before, as the anticipated pressure on Russia has seemingly been redirected toward Kyiv. President Zelensky finds himself in a profoundly difficult position, forced to navigate this new diplomatic reality while his nation remains under daily assault. In a carefully worded social media post following his conversation with President Trump, Zelensky emphasized that a true and lasting peace requires the fire to cease on both the battlefield and in the sky, a subtle but clear indication that a mere agreement on paper is insufficient without a complete end to Russian aggression. The stakes for the upcoming White House meeting could not be higher. With the two warring sides as far apart as ever, Zelensky must walk a diplomatic tightrope, demonstrating a commitment to peace without capitulating to demands that would dismantle his nation's sovereignty. Some foreign policy experts suggest his most viable strategy may be to adopt a tactic often used by Russian negotiators, responding with a yes, but to President Trump's proposals. This would allow him to affirm a desire for peace, while explicitly outlining the conditions Ukraine requires, such as security guarantees and the restoration of its territorial integrity. Such a maneuver could buy crucial time for both Ukraine on the battlefield and for European allies, who may now need to prepare to step in and provide the sustained support that the United States under President Trump appears increasingly unwilling to offer. The outcome of this meeting will likely determine not only the immediate future of U.S.-Ukraine relations, but also the broader security architecture of Europe. A significant diplomatic rift has emerged between the United States and its European allies following President Trump's recent meetings on the Ukraine war, revealing a fractured Western strategy and raising serious questions about the future of the conflict. European leaders who had met with the president just days earlier believed they had secured a mutual understanding to advocate for an immediate ceasefire as a first step toward peace. This shared objective was abruptly dismantled after President Trump's subsequent meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska, where the American leader publicly reversed his position, declaring a comprehensive peace agreement, not a ceasefire, as the new and sole goal. This sudden shift has left European capitals scrambling to recalibrate their approach without directly confronting the American administration. In the wake of this reversal, European nations have adopted a nuanced and cautious public stance. Their official statements have noticeably softened previous language, insisting on a precondition of ceasefire before negotiations, choosing instead to avoid an open contradiction with President Trump. However, they are simultaneously reinforcing other fundamental principles for a lasting peace, such as the non-negotiable condition that there must be no future limits on the size or capability of the Ukrainian military. This delicate balancing act appears designed to maintain a working relationship with the White House, while European governments urgently work to expand their own capacity to support Ukraine independently, preparing for a scenario where American support may become unreliable or conditional on terms favorable to Russia. The question of what precisely transpired in the meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin to cause such a dramatic about-face points to a fundamental imbalance in their dialogue. Analysts suggest that President Trump, who has long expressed a personal sympathy for Putin and a view of Russia as a resurgent great power, was likely presented with a detailed and unyielding narrative of the conflict from the Russian perspective. Faced with Putin's steadfast refusal to compromise on his core demands and recognizing the Russian leader's superior command of the intricate details of the war and its history, President Trump seemingly recalibrated his strategy. He now seems to see Ukraine as easier to push around than Russia. Because of this, he is putting pressure on the country that was invaded rather than the one that started the war. This highlights a huge problem. The Russian leader is focused and knows every detail. The American president has never shown a strong grasp of these complicated issues. This mismatch makes it very unlikely that any peace deal will be fair or last for long. In a remote Alaskan airfield, the world watched as two of the globe's most consequential leaders met for a brief and carefully choreographed summit. The event was rich with the symbolism of high-stakes diplomacy, the synchronized landings of the respective presidential jets, the fluttering flags and television graphics, and the two figures walking side by side down a narrow red carpet. Yet, when the display concluded, the substantive outcome was summed up by an uncharacteristically subdued President Donald Trump. "There's no deal until there's a deal," he stated during a subsequent press conference. The undeniable truth was that despite the spectacle, there was no deal. The summit served as a powerful piece of political theater for both men, each achieving a primary objective simply by participating. For President Trump, the event placed him squarely at the center of the world's attention, orchestrating a global media moment defined by powerful imagery. The scenes included a firm handshake where the president was seen patting his counterpart's hand and an intimate ride in the presidential limousine, a courtesy rarely extended to even the closest of allies. For Russian President Vladimir Putin, the meeting itself was a victory. As an indicted war criminal whose travel is restricted by over 100 nations, his reception on U.S. soil, complete with a red carpet and the full honors of a summit with an American president, conferred a level of legitimacy and parity he deeply craves. This stood in stark contrast to past U.S. administrations that had dismissed Russia's global influence. Throughout the event, The contrasting demeanors of the two leaders were telling. President Putin, seizing the opportunity, spoke warmly of U.S.-Russian proximity and cited a significant increase in bilateral trade. He lavished praise upon President Trump in the exaggerated fashion that has become a feature of his diplomatic engagements with Washington. In response, President Trump was notably restrained and circumspect. Even as Putin alluded to potential future agreements, Trump refrained from making any concrete commitments. The president, who has long branded himself as the world's premier dealmaker, departed without announcing any new accords. Instead, his remarks revisited familiar ground, including several references to what he termed the Russia hoax, a claim met with a characteristic smirk from the Russian leader. The meeting ultimately underscored a simple reality. While the imagery served both leaders' purposes, President Trump, who had proclaimed, "Deals are what I do," needed a tangible agreement far more than his Russian counterpart, who had already secured his prize by merely arriving. The recent summit between the leaders of the United States and Russia, while rich in ceremony, has drawn significant attention for its lack of tangible outcomes, prompting a deeper examination of the underlying philosophies of diplomacy at play. The approach championed by the American side appears to rest on a foundational belief that personal rapport between leaders can itself be a catalyst for compromise and agreement. This perspective, however, stands in stark contrast to the traditional realist school of foreign policy, which holds that nations are guided not by personal relationships, but by immutable national interests. This classic doctrine, associated with figures like Henry Kissinger, posits that alliances and enmities are transient, forever secondary to a country's strategic goals. This disconnect becomes critically evident when contrasted with the clearly defined and enduring worldview of the Russian president. His objectives are not new, nor are they subject to change based on personal chemistry. Long before his recent meeting, he had publicly articulated a profound sense of historical grievance, most notably describing the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. This sentiment is not merely rhetorical, but forms the bedrock of a decades-long project to restore Russia's sphere of influence and stature on the world stage. His actions, from the military interventions to sophisticated cyber campaigns aimed at destabilizing Western institutions, are all in service of this unwavering goal. He operates from a narrative where Russia is perpetually the victim of Western aggression, a perspective that shapes every negotiation. This context is essential for understanding the dynamic of any discussion concerning the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. From a conventional standpoint, the nation gaining territory typically has little incentive to negotiate, while the nation losing land is compelled to seek a settlement. Currently, Russia is the party making gradual territorial gains, while Ukraine is fighting to preserve its sovereignty. This positions Russia to dictate terms from a place of strength, with its long-term ambition of regional consolidation outweighing any immediate pressure for a ceasefire. When the Russian leader references the need to address the root causes of the conflict, it is a signal toward his deeply held historical revisionism, the belief that Ukraine is not a legitimate sovereign nation, but an inseparable part of Russia's historical and cultural empire. For any negotiation to be more than merely ceremonial, it must grapple with this fundamental and immovable conviction, a challenge that personal charm alone cannot overcome. Of course, here is a rephrased and expanded documentary article based on the provided text, adhering strictly to your guidelines. The recent high-profile meeting between the American and Russian presidents concluded with a notable absence of any formal agreement, an outcome that has prompted analysts to examine the strategic gains and losses for each leader involved. A revealing detail from the past continues to inform the present dynamic. According to the bipartisan 2020 Senate Intelligence Committee report, following a prominent magazine cover story, the American president once sent his Russian counterpart a handwritten note that included the phrase, "As you probably heard, I am a big fan of yours." This historical footnote underscores a personal dimension that many observers believe was a significant factor in the summit's proceedings. From a geopolitical standpoint, the Russian president emerged from the meeting having secured a major victory without conceding any ground. His primary achievement was the spectacle itself, receiving the full superpower treatment, including a red carpet reception on U.S. soil and the world stage equivalence with an American president, despite his nation's pariah status due to ongoing conflict and alleged war crimes. He arrived at the negotiation table having compromised on nothing beforehand and departed without being compelled to alter his nation's strategic objectives. For the leader of Ukraine, the embattled nation at the heart of the tensions that prompted the summit, the outcome could be viewed as a defensive success. The potential for a sudden agreement that might have sacrificed Ukrainian sovereignty or territory was averted. In this delicate context, the status quo, while precarious, represents a chance to continue the fight for another day. This aligns with the long-standing diplomatic principle that no deal is ultimately better than a bad deal. However, this very axiom raises a poignant question about the American participant. The summit was notably orchestrated by a president who has built a global identity and political brand upon his self-proclaimed prowess as the world's consummate negotiator. The central puzzle left in the wake of the carefully staged event is what becomes of that reputation when the principal deliverable, the deal itself, remains entirely absent. The meeting ultimately served to highlight the contrast between the tangible, propaganda-ready benefits gained by one side and the intangible and perhaps elusive rewards sought by the other. Despite their differences, the brash reality star and the calculating former KGB officer, Donald Trump's consistent refusal to directly confront Vladimir Putin appears deeply rooted in their unique and often perplexing friendship. Trump has repeatedly expressed a personal admiration for Putin's brand of strongman authority, a leadership style he openly envies and often praises. This personal affinity consistently overrides the geopolitical antagonism expected between their nations, leading Trump to dismiss or downplay Russian aggression, from election interference to the invasion of Ukraine. For Trump, the relationship seems less about strategic alliance and more about a mutual recognition of power and a shared grievance against the Western establishment that scrutinizes them both, making direct criticism of Putin a personal betrayal he seems unwilling to make. It's a deal forged not in treaties, but in shared resentment and a common enemy, the very institutions that seek to hold them accountable. But what happens when one man's utility to the other finally runs out? Let us know in the comments what you think of this proposal, and if you want to stay on top of this, smash that like and subscribe button.